Hi, welcome back to Learning to Learn at Home. In this episode, we're going to look at something called the parent-adult-child model, which is a really powerful way to understand how we interact with people and how we can interact with people in more healthy, productive ways. It was developed by a guy called Eric Berne, a psychiatrist back in the 1950s, as part of an approach to therapy known as transactional analysis. We're just going to have a brief introduction to it today. But as you'll see, even just a brief introduction gives us a very powerful insight into how we interact with people and how we can make those interactions more healthy and productive. The parent-adult-child model recognizes that there are three ego states, or three roles, if you like, that we can each inhabit at different times in the day and at different times in a conversation and at different times in our lives. Although they're called parent, adult, and child, they don't necessarily map onto whether you're a parent, an adult, or a child. Adults and parents can inhabit each of these ego states, and so can children. So we'll run through them in turn, and then we'll look at some examples of how these play out in the classroom and also in the home. The parent state, as you can see, is divided into two. We have on one side the nurturing parent, which is optimistic, hopeful for the future, caring, nursing, encouraging, and so on. But it can also be overdone and it can sometimes become smothering. And on the other side, we have the controlling parent, the parent that's interested in rules and discipline and going to bed at the right time and eating your vegetables and so on, giving orders and making judgments and being critical where necessary. And again, that can be overdone, and sometimes controlling parents can be overly critical, and we need to find a balance between these two approaches. Then we'll move to the child state, which, as you can see, is also divided into two. On the one hand, we have the adapted child, and the adapted child is the child who has learned from prior experience how to behave and what to expect from the adults around them. And that might be that they try to be polite and helpful and they try to fit in because they know that that elicits positive rewards and reactions from people around them. Or they might learn to be rebellious in certain ways. And we'll look at that a little bit later on. Then we have the free child, which is that wonderful, carefree, like that spontaneous state that children can inhabit, where they're adventurous and they're impulsive and instinctive and just anything goes, they're in the moment. But that can be challenging as well, because that's the state where children throw tantrums. And then in the middle we have the adult state, and the adult role is one where we think things through, that there's a rationality to it, things are sort of objective, things are held in balance, and this is what we think of when we say, we're going to be the grown-up or be the adult in the room and so on. So let's look at a couple of examples of how this plays out. So as a teacher, children would often turn up to my lesson without a pen, and 9 times out of 10 I would respond by finding one. I used to keep a load of them in my desk and say, oh, here you go, take this one. Sometimes I would say, oh, you give me something in return, but that would take ages and it eats into your lesson time. You say, oh, bring one next time. And that's crazy, isn't it? Because there's no reason to expect that the child will bring a pen to your next lesson. That dynamic sort of feeds itself. The child will learn that they'll just keep turning up to your lesson without a pen, and you'll give them one and it's not going to be a big problem. And then 1 time out of 10, I would snap and go, what are you doing? Why on earth are you turning up to my lesson without a pen? This is ridiculous. And so what might happen then is that the child will respond in the free child mode, and they might say, fine, then I'll just use this yellow felt tip that I found on the floor. And what you realize when you look at this model is that whatever we do, whether we behave in the nurturing parent role or in the controlling parent mode, it elicits a childlike response, whether that's an adapted child response or a free child response. So what we want to do is to think, well, how can we nudge this dynamic, this unhealthy parent-child dynamic? How can we make it into something that's more adult? And so it might be that the teacher, which I learned after about 8 years of teaching, is that you learn a little mini script. The kid turns up to your lesson without a pen, and without even looking at them, I would say, who can lend so-and-so a pen for a reward point? Thank you. So you say thank you because it assumes that somebody's going to comply with that. There's going to be somebody in the class who's got a spare pen, and kids like getting reward points. And that's the problem dealt with, and it's very, very effective. And then that allows the children to start to think more optimistically about the future, and they might think something like, I like getting reward points, I'll put some spare pens in my bag for next time. I'm not saying that this works every time, and I'm not saying that it works first time, but it's just an example of how by shifting into an adult mode we can elicit more adult responses from people around us. Let's look now at an example from in the home, one that's probably quite familiar to many people. So the adapted child keeps leaving their clothes on the floor, safe in the knowledge that the magic clothes fairies will come and they will just appear folded and cleaned back in their drawers or wardrobes. And again, the parent might respond in a nurturing way and they go, oh, can you please pick your clothes up from your room? I've asked you nicely 5 times now, it's still not happening. And that happens more and more times, and eventually they snap and go, tidy your room or you're grounded. This is ridiculous. I've told you so many times. We can see the parallels here with the pen example. And that might elicit another kind of an adapted response where the child will tidy their room under duress. They know that when the veins are bursting in their parents' temples, that now is the time to go up and tidy their room. But they do so under duress so that they're not doing this in a voluntary way. Or they might freak out and have a tantrum and slam the door and go, how dare you talk to me like that? Why are you shouting? And so on. Again, unhealthy dynamics that are very familiar to many people in their homes. And so how might we shift this into a more adult to adult mode? Well, it might be that you would say something like, if you don't put your clothes in the washing basket, they're not going to get cleaned. And then you just leave it at that. And then the child might think, oh, that's new. I've not heard them say that before. I'll ignore that and see how it goes. And then eventually they might think, hang on a minute, all my clothes really smell and they're all wrinkly and creased. Where is this washing basket thing anyway? Let's take some action to address this. So again, I'm not suggesting that this is how to be a great parent. This is just an example of how you can change the way that you say things, the way that you think about how we interact to elicit more adult responses from people. So there's a couple of scenarios that I'm going to leave with you to take away. There's a worksheet that you can download with some questions for reflection. But for each of these scenarios, I want you to think about how might the parent respond as a nurturing parent, first of all, and then as a critical parent, and then as an adult. And in each case, just like we did with those first 2 examples, think about how each of those responses might elicit a different kind of response from the child in the future. So here's the first scenario, which may be familiar to people. Amal is 11 and an only child. Her mum is a single parent and works long hours. Amal has an iPhone which is permanently glued to her hand. When she's not on her phone, she's using social media on her laptop. Amal's mum is worried about her screen time and wants her to take up a new hobby. She got a new guitar for Christmas, which she hasn't yet touched. So what might Amal's mum do here to shift this unhealthy dynamic into something that is going to lead to a better outcome? And the second scenario, again, one that may be familiar, Connor is 14. Since starting year 10, he has had several detentions for not doing his homework. Connor's dad feels like he always has to nag him to do his homework. Connor ends up rushing it on the bus often on the morning it's due to be handed in. So these are just some scenarios for you to take away and think about. I'm not going to provide you with any model answers for them. Once you familiarize yourself with this PAC model, you start to see how these dynamics play out in all kinds of different areas of your life, in terms of your family, in terms of workplaces, in terms of how you interact with friends and family members and so on. And what we want to do really is to elicit more adult to adult interactions. And so here are 3 top tips. Number 1, an adult would try to be proactive rather than reactive, where it's not like the homework is to be done at the last minute. There's a deadline looming. That isn't really the time when you want to be having this big conversation about homework. So you want to find a mutually convenient time where you can sit down and talk about this, so that it's not 5 minutes before their favourite program starts or where they've already arranged to go online with their friends or whatever. And this is something that is going to have to happen fairly regularly, depending on the nature of what it is that you're trying to achieve. So you might ask, how often shall we sit down and we'll return to this conversation and see how things are going? It's a really good idea to plan out what you want to say and to even rehearse it in advance, and to rehearse it from each of those roles. Think about how you might approach a particular issue with regard to your child's learning from a controlling parent perspective versus a nurturing parent versus an adult. Explain why it is that you want to talk about X. There's a really good TED talk by a guy called Simon Sinek called Start With Why, or I think he wrote a book called Finding Your Why. It's really important that people understand the why in order to do the what and the how. And you might want to agree some ground rules for how you will talk together And the reason that there's an asterisk there is that that's the topic of our next video in this series. The second key insight is that it's important to just take one thing at a time, and also to deal with one person at a time. So if you have multiple children in your home that you're homeschooling, for example, this might be difficult to do as a group. It might be something that's a lot easier in a one-to-one situation, because if you have a one-to-one conversation with somebody, there's only one relationship there. If there are 3 people involved in a conversation, there are 3 times as many relationships, aren't there? Because there's A to B, A to C, and then B to C. And so even just adding one person into a conversation makes things a lot more complicated. If you add a 4th person, suddenly there are 6 relationships. So it's a really good idea to just do one thing at a time, one person at a time. Start with some low-hanging fruit. Pick something that is going to be achievable so that you can start to get a sense of momentum. Identify a problem or an area that you want to address and express it clearly and calmly as much as you can. And stick with it until it's fixed, however long it takes. Or it might be that you agree to put something on ice together and you'll come back to it later on. But it's a really important thing to not try to start too many things going at once. Just stick with one thing, fix that thing, and then move on to the next one. And the third one is to try to be present. Something that's very common across all different approaches to therapy, which is where this PAC model originates, is the need to be authentic. They need to be congruent. They need to be in the moment and be honest, to articulate your feelings honestly. If you're feeling angry or upset, to explain why it is that you're feeling angry or upset without actually being angry or upset. This is not something that you would do in that moment. And it's important also to strive as far as possible for honesty by asking really honest questions of your children and also providing really honest answers where you can. Here are some questions for you to take away and reflect on. Please do go away and take this worksheet, have a think about those scenarios, and drop us a line, get in touch via our website. You can comment publicly on the Learning to Learn at home page, or you can message us privately if you'd rather do that. Next time, as I say, we're going to look at developing a set of ground rules or discussion guidelines to help guide how to have more positive, productive interactions and conversations with our children. Until then, be well, and I'll see you next time.